From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, August 11. After years and years, and maybe even a lifetime of neglect by politicians, renters are finally getting noticed.
The federal government is seeking to strike a deal with state premiers for a plan to strengthen renters' rights.
This week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese brought his focus to renters when he promised to negotiate with National Cabinet next week to come up with a plan to strengthen renters' rights across the country.
The Prime Minister will have the housing crisis firmly in his sights when he sits down with his state and territory counterparts in Brisbane next week, hoping to strike a deal not only to...
This comes after months of pressure from the Greens over rental rights, as the government tries to secure Greens support for its $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund.
People cannot wait until 2025 for a solution to the housing crisis. We have an opportunity right now in negotiations on this housing bill to work out a plan that invests billions of dollars in public and affordable housing now and stops rent increases right now. All we have to see is the government...
The Greens are demanding rental caps nationwide in return for their support in passing the bill. The Albanese government has refused that demand, but they are clearly feeling the heat on renters' rights, hence this week's announcement. So why have the rights of renters suddenly broken out of the political wilderness and into the mainstream? Why are the Greens, traditionally a party for environmentalists, so interested in this issue? And will any of it end up benefiting the third of Australians who rent their homes? To explore these issues this week, we have the dream team of our chief political correspondent David Crowe and senior economics correspondent Shane Wright. Gentlemen, welcome to Please Explain.
Great to be back.
Always a pleasure to see you, Jackie.
David, take us through exactly what Anthony Albanese has announced this week for renters. Is it a plan for a plan? How much detail do we actually have?
Plan for a plan is a pretty good way to describe it, Jackie. The Prime Minister is heading towards a meeting with state premiers and chief ministers, and what he's done is told Parliament on a couple of occasions now how confident he is about getting an outcome. Now, there's a couple of things on the agenda. One is a set of national principles to protect renters' rights. Now, this won't go so far as to be a rent freeze, which is what some people want him to do, but it will put in place some tougher regulation to protect renters. Of course, one of the key things that Anthony Albanese says is that these rules can only be passed by state and territory governments. And I think that's a fair point. It's not traditionally the preserve of the federal government to get involved in rental issues in the major capital cities, for instance. But the other thing he's talking about, I think, is actually more significant in some ways and also an area where there's more likely to be progress. And that's on planning and zoning. So that's the big conversation, and that's where we're heading to at the National Cabinet meeting, which is going to be held in Brisbane on Wednesday.
I just wonder if Albanese is being a little bit tricky here, though, because he spent a lot of time telling voters that actually the federal government doesn't have a lot of control over rental matters because they're up to state governments and local councils.
It's up to states and territories. This is because different states will have different circumstances. States and territories are taking their own response and are dealing...
The Commonwealth does not control rents. The Commonwealth does not have the capacity either to abolish...
Has that changed, or has the politics changed? It seems like he's trying to have a bob each way by saying, on the one hand, we don't control this stuff, it's nothing to do with us. And on the other hand, he's saying, actually, we do have a bit of control and we're going to fix it or try to fix it.
He's got some influence at National Cabinet because, of course, the states always want money from Canberra. So that ensures some influence around the National Cabinet table. But I think that's as far as it goes. I mean, clearly there's a big contest now between Labor and the Greens over housing policy, and the alternative from the Greens is rent control nationwide, a rent freeze nationwide that they say would save renters at least $3 billion a year, maybe $4.9 billion a year. Albanese is not willing to go anywhere near that. Some of the state premiers ditto. So therefore, we end up with this argument about, or this move towards national principles on protecting renters. And we don't know yet how firm those principles will be. But I think the fact that National Cabinet is talking about rent protection highlights the influence that the Greens are having on the debate, because without this debate in Canberra, maybe that wouldn't be on the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that. The Greens have been putting a lot of pressure on the government over renters' rights. And, you know, particularly over their sort of brinkmanship over the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, which is stymied in the Senate and which the government is threatening to sort of call a double dissolution election over. David, this sort of represents Labor's worst nightmare in an existential sense, this threat from the left that the Greens, who have traditionally been obviously a party of environmentalism and climate change action, they're mining this very rich vein of voter disaffection and this cohort of people, renters, who represent a third of the population, who have completely been neglected and left out of the political debate, I would say, for decades. I mean, how much of a threat is this to Labor from the Greens?
I think it's a very significant threat from the Greens at a political level. And, you know, I never believe in the phrase playing politics. Nobody's playing politics here. This is politics. This is about the Greens and Labor seeking support in the community for their positions. And the Greens want to use that support, yes, to win seats in Parliament, but also, yes, to get their policies enacted. And it's an almighty tussle between those two parties. I don't think it means that the Greens need all those Labor voters. You know, the Greens are doing something like 12% with a primary vote. They're really only after enough votes to get ahead of Labor in some of those inner city Greens seats, like the one that Max Chandler Mather won at the last election, Griffith, in relatively inner area of Brisbane. So they can replicate that. And this issue is, I'm told, turning up some very strong support for the Greens at community town hall meetings. They're also getting out there with door-knocking campaigns to use housing to build support. So that's something that Labor's got to counter. Labor is countering it. And I think the dispute over the Housing Australia Future Fund is really only one aspect of this.
Max Chandler Mather, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the government compromised putting up $2 billion of new money for housing. Wasn't that the moment for you to compromise and pass the long-term bill?
Well, we made 2 points to the government. Firstly, they weren't spending any money directly right now on building public and affordable housing. Obviously, we've been able to secure $2 billion. But our other point is you can't ignore the 1/3 of this country who rents. And there's a very specific reason.
There's a personal element too, because Max Chandler Mather really irritates Anthony Albanese in Parliament. He's very sharp with his questions in question time, always aims them, or mostly aims them, right at Anthony Albanese. And really it's presenting this fresh face for the Greens, challenging, you know, this Labor government as being too soft on housing, not going hard enough, not being willing to make the really tough calls to address the concerns of renters. And that's a dangerous dynamic for Labor, especially among the next generation. That is why I think the onus is on Anthony Albanese and the Labor premiers to show at the National Cabinet meeting on Wednesday that they've got an answer. It may not be enough to get Max Chandler Mather over the line on the Housing Australia Future Fund, but it's got to be enough to assure the wider community that even if the Housing Australia Future Fund is not passed, we've got $2 billion in social housing funding. We've got a national agreement on principles to protect renters. We've got an agreement on how to build more homes, you know, this idea about planning and zoning and the National Housing Accord. They've got to show action on all these fronts because they're under pressure.
They definitely seem like they're on the defensive on this issue. Shane, Max Chandler Mather rents himself, and he makes the point that there are hardly any MPs in Parliament who also rent. The vast majority of them are homeowners. And he says that's a big reason why renters have been left out of the political debate. Do you think, I mean, are renters treated particularly badly in Australia compared to other countries? And, you know, I'm sort of thinking particularly of Europe, I suppose.
Max is right. There's only 2 or 3 of the 150 MPs and 76 senators who actually rent.
Wow.
There's a fair whack of them who are landlords. So they're looking at renting from the other side of the equation. In terms of Australia's laws, and this is the part of the problem which the Greens won't accept, and this goes to some of the points that David's been bringing up, that while Max Chandler Mather has a great profile politically inside the entire aspect of the property industry from buyers to renters, people are fairly critical of him for not accepting how the Australian rental system works and that there is a whole hodgepodge of state and territory rules. And so, yeah, he has great political profile. Inside the sector, people are saying this guy has got issues because he doesn't want to see how the whole system works. And this part of this is say you want to have a pet in Victoria as a renter, you have different rights than if you want to have a cat or a dog in the ACT or in Queensland or in the NT. The rights of Australian renters are absolutely terrible compared to the rest of the developed world, even compared to the United States, which doesn't treat renters quite as well as you would expect. Europe has a very different culture when it comes to renting, and parts of Asia where you have generational rental arrangements. Here, and it's partly because of the tax system around housing, it's partly because if you go back to the post-World War II period when the Chifley government and then the Menzies government said, we want you to own your own home, that pushed renting to one side. And the rights around it were really poorly developed. And we've got to this point right now where you've got a third of the population renting who can't put up, say, for instance, a nail in the wall to hang up their favourite photo, or can't have a cat or a dog and have poor treatment by their landlords. And this is it. We have 2.5 million landlords we do have too many landlords in this country. Everyone says, I'm a great landlord. This is like the old studies that show 80% of Australians think they're above average drivers. You can't be have an 80% above average driving rate, the same sort of thing. You are going to have poor landlords. Landlords run into trouble because they think that their property will appreciate in value. We looked at some work earlier this year showing landlords so often would be better off putting their money into a super account than trying to gamble away on the property market to give them a huge capital gain. But renters are the ones who cop it in the neck from this hodgepodge of, and it is state law, it is territory law, it's not federal law. That's why you're seeing some movement, say, from Dan Andrews, you've seen it from Anastasia Palaszczuk around some of the rights of renters, because renters are absolutely entitled to be fed up with the way they've been treated for a very long time.
David, there's a real generational element to this, and indeed to the whole housing affordability debate, which is, that young people feel locked out of the market. I mean, traditionally, and particularly when the coalition was in power, I think the thinking was that, nobody really wanted to do anything about housing affordability because housing affordability means bringing down the costs of homes, and that is always going to be unpalatable to people who own homes. But I think now we're seeing a sort of middle ground open up where parents who do own their own homes are worried about their children being locked out of the market. Can you just talk us through how this is playing out sort of along generational lines and what the politics of that is?
The appeal of the Greens is definitely towards the younger generation on this issue, but whether that's working is yet to be really confirmed. They believe it is. Younger voters skew towards the Green. As they get older, they shift towards the middle ground. History suggests that. Whether that happens on this issue, we don't know. Labor took to the 2019 election a platform that I regarded at the time and regard now as skewed towards a younger generation. They wanted to scale back tax breaks, usually enjoyed by older people with more assets. Negative gearing reform being a prime example of that. That didn't succeed then, didn't win them the election. So I think Labor's got to be very careful about where they head on this. And it's interesting that when they've put out an issues paper in the last week on housing and homelessness, they did not say, we want some answers on tax here. So they're just not going there. So that's playing it safe. It could mean that the Greens have got a lot to work with there, because the Greens' position is get rid of negative gearing, spend more on Commonwealth rent assistance, give more money to the states so that they can freeze rents, spend more on social housing, using those savings from the removal of negative gearing. That appeals to a younger demographic. We haven't seen in our Resolve political monitor so far a big fall in support for Labor on housing. But we're going to have to keep asking voters about this, because it's turning into what I regard as a totemic issue for the government. They've put other things to the Senate. They put the safeguard mechanism on climate change to the Senate, and they got that through. They put the National Reconstruction Fund to the Senate, and they got that through, a $15 billion fund. Of all the things that are blocked and are now turning into the potential double dissolution trigger, it's housing. And so that's where we've got to watch very carefully to see the drift of voters away from Labor, if that happens.
I was going to say, Jackie, had dinner with one of the heads of one of the big banks this week. One of the interesting things was that they said there are two big issues facing the finance sector and the Australian economy: climate change and housing. Now, our banks are built on mortgages. The entire Australian financial system would fall apart if the mortgage system collapsed, if there was a huge devaluation in properties. The Australian economy would come to a standstill, and we'd all be looking for a cave to live in with a can opener and some canned goods. And the point was, the solution, they went around the table talking about it, and they said, I don't know what the solution is. There are so many different issues going on. So the Greens are picking up, say, on a rent cap or rent freezes and rent cap. But that doesn't solve why the affordability of a house has gone up. They haven't seen a huge fall in the number of people falling behind on their mortgages. And they pointed out this is because to get a mortgage, you actually have to be very well off nowadays.
Yep.
So they could see the problems at a social level as well as the economic level, and the policy solutions are extraordinarily broad. So anyone who comes in and says, I have the solution, don't believe them.
David, just quickly to finish up, what outcome are we likely to see next week from National Cabinet, and is the government actually going to go through with its double dissolution election if they don't get their housing package through the Senate with Greens' assistance?
Okay, first up, the housing package goes back to the Senate in October. The Greens have just adjusted some of the timing on that, so everybody's got a bit of time to think about where they vote. I think talk of a double dissolution election on this is self-indulgent by the government. I don't think voters are remotely interested in a game over an early election on this issue. The government's got to get on with governing. Potentially there's a trigger for a 2025 election that's a double dissolution rather than a standard half-Senate election, right? That's possible. I think the Greens can fight on this issue while voting for the Housing Australia Future Fund, letting it through, and they've still made their message very clear to voters that they want more on housing. So I think it's possible to pass it and campaign hard on housing. In terms of National Cabinet, on Wednesday, national principles to protect renters. I think we'll all be asking next week, well, when are the states going to act on that and what are they going to do? Some of them will claim we're already doing it. But I think we've got to look really carefully at agreements on planning, zoning, speeding up approvals for projects. This is extremely contentious because it's easy for a National Cabinet agreement to claim that they will do this, and then when you get an individual project in Brunswick or Chatswood, you suddenly get locals saying, no, we don't want that. But I think that's where things will have to go, and National Cabinet really sets up a process towards approving more projects, getting more dwellings built because of this looming shortage.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining us today to unpack some of these deeply thorny issues. I hope we can have you back on again as a duo in the near future.
The dynamic duo will be back.
Good.
I was thinking more Bill and Ben, but yeah, we'll be back.
The original odd couple, but so lovable.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong with technical assistance by Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thank you for listening.